And welcome to another video. Today it is the 19th of January and we have some huge news today that I want to get into. And it's mainly focusing on Bakhmut and all of the fighting around it, Klishchiivka, and I'm also going to get into some of the situation around the Siversk line. I'm going to try to keep it brief though, just so everybody can get the main information, and we'll get into more specifics about the situation in other videos, but I just want to make this one quick for the sake of time. So let's zoom in and just work our way from the south to the north. And we have to start off with the situation around Klishchiivka, which is very interesting. So I wasn't able to make a video for the past 2 days, but over the past 2 days, the Ukrainians have withdrawn from the town itself. And this is because it was really untenable. The Russians, they were applying pressure from all sides onto the Ukrainian fortifications in the town itself. From the south, we talked about how they took over this trench fortification over here. From the north, we talked about how they took over the rail station. And then, of course, using their positions around this pond in Andriivka, they were attacking directly from the east. And so they were being developed from all sides. And really the straw that broke the camel's back was taking the fortifications here to the south. And then using these fortifications, the Russians were also able to cross over the water canal, and they were able to take over some of the forest belts and some of the ridges over here. They took over a minor trench complex over here, and they were able to approach this important mine, which is located near Stupochki. Now, as we've seen, the Ukrainians have withdrawn from the town itself, but they have not totally withdrawn from this entire area. They're still standing firm in the heights, the height regions of Klishchiivka. So you can see that the hills over here, they overlook the town itself. So the Ukrainians, they built some pretty extensive fortifications here over the past 8 years or so. And it's like all around the perimeter, so it can't really be assaulted by being flanked. It just has to be a frontal assault onto the trenches in order to overrun the Ukrainian positions over there, which is why it is such an advantageous position. It also means that the Russians, when they enter the town, they could be fired upon by the Ukrainians, who would have the high ground in this case. And so that's an issue for the Wagner group that they're going to have to deal with as they try to clear the town right now. It's one of the reasons why they're not really focusing on assaulting these fortifications frontally. They might try to avoid it altogether, or they might try to create the perfect situation in which the Ukrainians will have to withdraw from these fortifications because they would be at risk of an encirclement. Which is why we're already hearing about reports that the Russians have advanced around the really just adjacent to the water canal, but just to the east of it, over here, taking over, again, forest belts, trench lines, and ridges. And they have been able to take over a lot of the area that's flanking the fortifications to the west. So it's not just this one defense node. There are several over here that they look like water reservoirs, but they're basically just defensive fortifications now. And I've found several of them on the map that are being utilized by the Ukrainians. And so now a lot of those are being flanked, and these are some of the main roads that are supplying these defensive nodes from Ivanivske. And so if Russia could reach these roads over here, they could cut them off physically, and then they won't be able to get resupplies, or they won't even be able to retreat because the Russians will be present over there. So we actually saw something very interesting in the Ukrainian General Staff report. They always give a breakdown of the towns that are being attacked by the Russians, and they also give a list of the towns that are being shelled. But in terms of frontline towns where there's fighting going on, one of the towns that was mentioned was actually pretty far from the front lines relatively. So it's called Alexandro Shultini. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but the point is that this would imply that the Russians have been able to tap into their gains to the west of the canal, and that they've been able to take over just all these open areas, all these fields to the north of Bilahora and this town over here. And now they're assaulting them from the north, where the Ukrainians might not have expected that, because they were expecting perhaps an attack from Ozaryanivka, and then they would cross over and attack it from this direction, from the south. And this would not be advantageous because they would be attacked from both sides by the Ukrainians from Bilahora and from Dilivka. So the Russians have been able to rout the Ukrainians, you could say, in this area, and it could spread them out thin as they're being attacked in several axes. Another thing that I've heard is that Ivanivske is now in threat of being attacked. So the Wagner group, they are sending scouts out through these forested areas in trying to reach Ivanivske at the moment. Ivanivske is still under full Ukrainian control, but there is a threat from both sides right now. You see these two arrows, so there's threats from both of these directions that there could be probing attacks onto the Ukrainian line in Ivanivske. And Ivanivske is so important because it's the one town that's along the road which supplies Bakhmut from the west. So you have Konstantinivka, and the road over here leads to Bakhmut, and it crosses through Ivanivske. Same thing with Chasiv Yar. There's a road here. There's one other road that goes through Komove, and that's the only one that's not under direct Russian threat right now. Now, in terms of the situation in Bakhmut itself, no real changes. Basically, what Russia's doing over here is they're pinning down the Ukrainian troops. They're trying to prevent them from moving over to other axes of fighting. So they are engaging in a lot of tense urban battles, and absolutely they are incurring casualties in some of these assaults on the apartment buildings, on the residential complexes, on factories and such. But again, the entire point is a war of attrition. The entire point is for Ukraine to be pinned down because they have 27 brigades in this general area, and a lot of them are just stuck in Bakhmut right now because if they were to be moved elsewhere, then the Russians could have a breakthrough into the city itself. So that's part of the reason why they're doing that. So there hasn't been many gains in Opitny, there hasn't been many gains in Zabakhmutka. It's just positional in nature. To the northeast, we have seen some gains by the Russians. They have been able to use their new positions around Pitorodny to take over some of the fields to the south. There is fighting going on around this meat processing plant over here, and you could see there's geolocated footage of just back and forth fighting over here. But again, nothing really significant that I can really definitively change the map based off of. Now, over here in Krasnohora, this is very important. The Ukrainian troops are not actually withdrawing from Krasnohora, to my knowledge. The Wagner Group map actually shows that the Ukrainians are still in Krasnohora. All the Russian maps that are pretty mainstream, they also indicate this. And then, of course, the Ukrainian maps, they just indicate that this entire area is a gray zone. So the Ukrainians are actually moving in some new units into Krasnohora. Now, in terms of the types of units, some of them are coming in from Bakhmut. Some of them are actually going to be some territorial defense units that may have been in other oblasts, so from Sumy or Chernihiv. So those are being moved into this general area, just this road line from Blahodatne to Parasukivka, which is now the new Ukrainian defensive line. And they are trying to hold out at Krasnohora for as long as possible. I don't think they'll stay in Krasnohora, even if they try to stay at Blahodatne and Parasukivka, because again, there's a bulge over here. The Wagner Group could, in theory, storm this area, storm the flanks, and encircle the Ukrainian troops over here, which could play out in a similar manner to that of Soledar. And so I think what the Ukrainians are doing is they're just trying to bog them down right now with these defensive fortifications that they've set up to prevent them from attacking the new defensive line, which is being built by the Ukrainian sappers. And really, for that same reason, the situation just to the north around Soledar and around the river over here, the Bakhmutovka River, and the heights, nothing's really changed over here. The Ukrainians are still entrenched on the heights, and the Wagner Group is not assaulting that area actively, although they are assaulting Blahodatne actively right now. So we'll see what goes on there. In Krasnopolivka, there is geolocated footage from the Skala battalions. This is an aerial reconnaissance battalion of the Ukrainians. They have a lot of Western artillery, and they utilize a lot of drones. So they have some footage released of them targeting some advancing Russian troops. So this indicates that the town of Krasnopolivka is now being attacked. So it might even be under Russian control by now because it's so small. So again, you're seeing how Russia is not stopping the attacks to the north. They're starting to apply pressure onto Mykolaiivka, Rozdolivka, Vesele. Vesele is under really grave threat right now because it's being attacked from the east, Berestove, from the south, Yakovlivka, and then also it's being attacked, you could say now, from the west as well because of these Russian positions that are very close to Rozdolivka. So again, the entire point of this thing is not just to pin down Ukrainian troops, but it's also to present an opportunity to either attack Siversk or to get Ukraine to withdraw from Siversk, because really they're steadily advancing along the supply route into Siversk, and eventually it's going to become very difficult for Siversk to be supplied because there's going to be fire control over the supply lines coming in from Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, but also there's going to be a threat of encirclement of the grouping in Siversk. And so that's why we're seeing currently the Russian attacks that are going on to the south, and then we're also seeing them try to advance against the Ukrainian fortified forest belts and rail lines over here in the more eastern part of the front line. And this is why there's also a lot of back and forth fighting going on in Spirny. Speaking of Spirny, the Ukrainians had taken over this piece of land over here. I'm just going to go over its perimeter. You can see this general area, there's some bush lines and such. So there was back and forth fighting over here. The Ukrainians took it over in order to get a wider perimeter and to prevent a Russian breakthrough into the town itself. The reason why Spirny is so important is because it is one of the main defensive nodes on the Luhansk front, which is preventing the Russians from advancing directly onto Siversk. And so now the Russians were able to retake this area of land. They were able to put pressure on the oil plant over here and onto the town itself. But Ukraine still holds it. It is contested, I would say. And we'll have to see what happens over here. But it is an integral part of Ukraine's defensive line, so remember that. If it falls, there's also Ivano-Darivka and the fortifications to the west, so just remember that. And all in all, the Russians are starting to apply pressure also onto Bilohorivka, which is another one of these defensive nodes. There's a water processing plant in Bilohorivka, which has a lot of Ukrainian troops. So yeah, a lot of the fighting is now being conducted by the LPR, for instance, in this area, and by the Wagner group, less by Russian regulars. And the situation is not looking good in Siversk, although it is probably looking worse in Bakhmut, where the supply lines are being cut off right now. I do want to get into more specifics, but I will do that in another video. But this is just brief update about the situation on the front line, and I'm sure we'll update more as we go forward. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys.